tonight you have just observed something very profound. Perhaps you even took the bread and the wine. You've been, if you were reaching out and taking the bread and sharing the wine, you were proclaiming that there was a day when you were guilty, when you had no right to stand before the God of heaven, and the God of heaven came instead in your place, in the person of Jesus, and he died so that you could be forgiven. And so you've taken bread saying, Jesus, thank you that you died instead of me. And you've taken wine saying, Jesus, you stood in the way of the judgment of God for me so that I could be forgiven. And that's really the highlight, isn't it, of our worship together, that we can share the bread and the wine. And it is actually the headline of what we want to be resonating from our community here at Oak Hall Church, that we are not able to stand before God. It's all right, God, here I am now. We couldn't stand like that before him. But that God has come in our place, in the person of Jesus, and has taken the punishment that should have been ours so that we could be forgiven, so that we could be restored, so that we could be renewed, so that the destruction that was coming our way, well, it would instead be upon Jesus. And we've just proclaimed that. We've proclaimed the Lord's death until he comes, as we've shared the bread and wine now. It's tremendous. This week, I went for a meeting up in London. I went on the train, one of the rare ones I managed to find. And as I got into town, I was meeting someone right in the middle in Warren Street. And it was meant to be a meeting about some of the technical stuff to do with the expeditions. But very quickly, we got onto exactly this subject. And he said, Andy, it's a new idea. It's a new idea. This idea that Jesus died for our wrongness, that God came in our place. It's a new idea. I said, you know, it's really interesting you think that, because I was reading a passage that is from 1,500 plus years before Jesus ever came, and it shows us that this wasn't a new idea at all, but that this was God's plan throughout history. And we went through the passage that we're going to go through tonight, that Josh has just read us. So let's look at this together. It's Exodus 17, page 75, as we've heard. Verse 1, they're on the road, they're on their travels. Where are they going? Do you remember? They're headed towards the promised land. Where are they coming from? They're coming out of slavery, and they're moving through the desert towards the place that God has chosen for them. This is a real group of people in history who have been set free and are now heading towards a place of freedom. And they have, of course, experienced God's intervention time after time. They came up against a sea, and they couldn't cross it. And behind them was an army coming. There was no way out. And then God opened the way through the sea, and they were rescued. They got to a point where they were thirsty. They didn't have anything to drink because the water was bitter. And God said, put this particular piece of wood in the water, and the water could then be drunk. It was sweet. They were thirsty, and God provided for them. Not long later, they were hungry, and God provided bread from heaven, manna, frosties, something like that at least, and quail. So meat and wafers, and they ate time and time again. It looked like there was no way forward, and then God opened the way up for them. And now here they are. They're traveling still, and we're in Exodus 17, and they camp at Rephidim. Oh no, but verse 1, you see the last part of the sentence, there was no water for the people to drink. So what do you think they're going to do? Do you think they're going to remember how Moses said at the Red Sea, be still, the Lord will fight for you? How God provided for them all the other occasions. So we'll just wait and see what he does. Isn't this tremendous? Isn't this exciting? I wonder how God's going to provide for us this time. Maybe you're at some point like that in your life tonight. You're up against some barrier that seems impassable. I wonder what stance of heart yours is. Well, these people in verse 2, this is what happened. So they quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." Moses replied, "Why'd you quarrel with me? Why'd you put the Lord to the test?" But the people were thirsty for water there, verse 3, and they grumbled against Moses. They said, "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to make us and our children and livestock die of thirst?" You see how quickly our human hearts forget about God's provision. Look, we've been celebrating God's provision. You've experienced God's provision. You've seen him opening ways when they seemed impossible. And, well, just like their hearts, our hearts soon forget it. We soon go into panic mode. And here they are, grumbling and panicking, saying, "God, maybe God's intentions are evil for us." And verse 4, we've heard it. Moses says, "What am I going to do? They're ready to stone me." And now God sets up a situation like a court. I don't know if you've ever been in court, where you've got the judge, and then you've got the two parties, and the judge is going to decide between the two parties. And here it is in verse 5. The Lord answered Moses, "Go out in front of the people, take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go." So there's a kind of judge team comes up, Moses and the elders. And Moses, he's told to bring the staff of God's judgment with him. This was the staff that brought these curses on Egypt. This is the staff that opened the sea. This staff is going to be important in the story as the story of Exodus continues, but it represents God's authority to judge. And I think we can all guess what's going to happen. Here's Moses and the elders, and they're holding God's staff of judgment. And if I was one of the Israelites now, I'd be thinking, "Oh, what have we done?" And sure enough, verse 6, "I will stand there before you by the rock at Horeb," verse 6. So now here's Moses with the staff, here's the elders, and now here's this rock. And God has said that I will stand before the rock. And of course, all the crowd, all the masses, all the grumbling people who are starting to think, "What have we done?" are all standing there as this drama begins to unfold. And they've seen what has happened when the judgment of God comes on different people. And you can imagine the terror and the anticipation for those who are a little more keyed in to what was going on. There's going to be judgment now on us all. What have we done? We've grumbled. We've forgotten God's provision. And then in verse 6, God says this, "Strike the rock, and water will come out of it for the people to drink." So Moses did this in the sight of the elders of Israel. You see what's going on? There's a guilty people, a sea of guilty people. I would be among the guilty people. And we're all looking up, and we can see now there is the judgment of God, and it's coming down towards us. And we've been told by Moses that this is the rock where God stands. And perhaps there's going to be judgment coming from where God stands on us, and we're terrified. And then God says, "Don't strike the people." God says, "Strike the rock." And so Moses strikes the rock. And out of the rock comes this water, this refreshing water gushing out, provision. This water that brings healing, this water that brings life, this water that brings restoration, this water of loving kindness, so that all the animals and all the people and all the children, the hundreds of thousands of them, they can drink and be provided for. What has happened? The people are guilty, and the judgment of God has fallen on the rock. Has fallen on God. What is that about? Some of us here tonight, you know what that's about. And some of us are thinking, I don't know. To be honest, what's that about then? Well, it's about this. It's a picture of what God's intention throughout history has been. And unless he spelt it out so clearly for us, we wouldn't ever dare to guess that this might have been God's intention. That there's a humanity that is guilty. We're guilty because we're disconnected from the God we're made to know, and we're disconnected by our own choice. We've said, God, I'm going to be in charge, and now this relationship that we're made for has been broken. So there's a guilty humanity, and we deserve God's judgment. But instead of us receiving God's judgment, God comes. He comes in the person of Jesus, and he dies on a cross so that the wrath of God would be upon God, so that you and me could receive the abundance and the healing and the provision and the springs of water that bring life. That's what the message of Jesus is all about. Have you had that? Do you know that? Do you know what that's about? It's life-changing, life-transforming. The only thing that connects us in this room, the main thing that connects us in this room, is that we're all people who can't make our way to God, but God has made his way to us, and he has taken the punishment, the wrath, the judgment that should be on us. He's taken it on himself. I've got a couple of questions for you, but just before them, let me read this verse. We just have had from 1 Corinthians 11, speaking about the bread and the wine that Josh read to us. And in 1 Corinthians 10, the page before, it says this in verses 3 and 4, speaking about these people in that moment in history. 1 Corinthians 10, verses 3 and 4. They all ate the same spiritual food and drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that accompanied them, and that rock was Christ. So Paul is saying in 1 Corinthians that it's a picture of what Jesus did as Moses strikes the rock to bring water and provision, as God receives the wrath of God so that the people could be provided for. Amazing picture, isn't it? Isn't it beautiful? Well, here's a couple of questions. I love this new format for our evenings. So let's have a little bit of a think and a chat. They're coming up on the screen. So does this passage change your view of grumbling? And how? And how about this? How does this account show God's loving kindness to his people? So let's just take a couple of minutes and then we'll continue with the next part of the passage. Well, I wonder how this is changing our view of grumbling. You know, it's actually, we can see that in this context, it's a way of expressing our unbelief in God's goodness and his provision and his purposes. And that's challenging, isn't it? And how about his loving kindness? Wow, isn't it incredible, his loving kindness, that God would stand in the way of the wrath that we deserve. And this isn't an idea that's isolated in one or two spots in Scripture, or some idea that somebody came up with a few hundred years ago, like my friend at lunch just a couple of days ago was saying. This is what God has been, well, lining up as a concept throughout history, and here he is doing it in this passage tonight, so that we would look out for the ultimate moment when God himself would come to stand in the way of the wrath that the guilty deserve. And it was when Jesus came. just a side note, for those of you who know the scriptures well and perhaps study them a lot, you might have been aware of this story, at least you thought you were, because you've perhaps read it in Numbers chapter 20. It's the same place, it's the same scene, the people are thirsty again, and they're saying they want water, and then Moses strikes the rock, but this time there's something wrong. And he strikes the rock, and he's kind of complaining about them, and he whops the rock twice, and water comes out, and the whole stance of the account sounds totally different. And do you know, this week, you probably know the Bible better than me, and you were thinking, well, I knew that was two accounts. Well, this week, I was trying to work out what's going on here? And actually, of course, it is two accounts. It's not two accounts of the same event. It's two events that happened at the same place. And this is the first. And then the people make their way to Sinai, and God gives the law. And then as they come back through the same spot, they're thirsty again. And they stand in front of the same rock. But this time, Moses' whole stance of heart is completely different. And the Lord on this occasion in Numbers 20 says, speak to the rock. But instead, Moses strikes the rock, and he hits it twice. And now, as Moses, he moves beyond what God has asked him to do. Well, that's the point where God says, look, Moses, you're not going to enter the promised land. So it's easy to kind of put these two events and think they're the same thing. They're not. They're two different events. One's before Sinai and one is after Sinai. And so here on this point, at this moment in history, as Moses strikes the rock, he's doing exactly what God has asked him to do. And it's the second event, when he's been told to speak to the rock and he strikes it instead, that he's acting wrongly, and that judgment comes to Moses. Just in case you were wondering. Well, the next bit is now a shocker. You know, the people of it, maybe you feel like this. Like, I've just got through this, I've just learned this now, and I know how to handle this. So could I just have a bit of a picnic for a few weeks and just chill for a few weeks and sit in this place of victory, and then later I'll be ready, Lord, for the next lesson. Maybe that's how you feel. But actually it's relentless here, because now in verse 8, just as they've been provided with this refreshing, revitalizing, healing water, an army comes and attacks them in verse 8. And you see it's the Amalekites came and attacked the Israelites. Now, all through history, there have been kind of two streams. There's been Cain and Abel. There's been those who are for the purposes of God and those who are against the purposes of God. You know, the faith that you have embraced as those who are followers of Jesus is not a nationalistic faith or a racist faith about a certain race of people and not another. This passage is speaking about a group of people who represent those who are the enemies of God. And there have been those throughout history who are the enemies of God, those who choose to stand against God's purposes. But it's also very clear throughout the scriptures that God's intention is that every tribe and language and people and nation would be drawn into his purposes. And that God's intention from the very outset was that all nations would be blessed. And God very carefully explains how a person who is outside the purposes of God, whatever nation they're from, can become an insider in the purposes of God. And it's by humbling themselves to who God is and seeking to live for him. And in our point, after the cross, that is simply by coming to Jesus, the one who is taken God's wrath for us and putting our trust in him. But here we are. The Amalekites are coming. And Moses, in verse 9, says to Joshua, choose some of our men to go out to fight against the Amalekites. Tomorrow, I will stand on top of the hill with the staff of God in my hands. It's interesting, this tomorrow. Do you remember how, as we went through Exodus, through the different plagues that came on Egypt, again and again, God would say, tomorrow this judgment is going to come. Tomorrow this plague is going to come. And now the Amalekites are coming, and Moses says, tomorrow I'll go with the judgment of God's staff in my hands. There's a hint there about God's holding back of judgment, I think. It's not something that he's just going to crash in on today, but it's tomorrow. Interesting, isn't it? And so, the next day, verse 10, Joshua fights the Amalekites. But the action isn't actually in the valley, but the action is on the top of the hill. And as long in verse 11, as long as Moses held up his hands, the Israelites were winning. But whenever he lowered his hands, the Amalekites were winning. What did he have in his hands? He had the staff of God in his hands. He had the judgment of God in his hand. The wrath of God in his hand, this staff. And he holds it up. And yes, it relates to prayer. But at this moment, it's actually also relating to the judgment of God. And as the symbol of the judgment of God is held high, well, those who are the enemies of God experience defeat. And that staff is held high with the help of others until the point that the victory is completely won. And verse 13, so Joshua overcame the Amalekite army with the sword. It's interesting that Moses isn't doing this on his own. He says, right, all right, lads, you carry on. I'm going up the mountain. Crack on. I'll be up there. But it's team. It's working together. And, I think that is a really important principle of God's work in the 21st century as well. That we stand together. That we stand side by side. We kind of support each other's arms as we stand together in the purposes of God. And then this judgment is fulfilled in verse 13. And then verse 14, there is this, that this mustn't be forgotten. I will completely blot out the name of Amalek from under heaven. And remember, this represents those who stand against God. Those who stand against God, they will be blotted out. It's another reminder that there's a judgment coming. And eventually, in Esther, the last descendants of this tribe, they still are trying to destroy the people of God. But in Esther, we find that they finally are destroyed. But Hebrews picks up this theme, that throughout history, there have been those who stand against the people of God. And here we are in the 21st century. I don't think we should be surprised. We're going to be opposed as those who stand up for who Jesus is, who stand up to speak out that there's a God who takes the wrath for us, that none of our goodness is good enough, but that has died in our place so that we can be forgiven. And there are going to be those who try to silence us. But actually, if we are in line with the purposes of God, well, it's the purposes of God that are going to prevail. And the last paragraph, verses 15 down to 16, Moses built an altar, and he called it, "The Lord is my banner." There would have been banners waving probably in that battle to indicate where the different divisions of the army were and where to rally if under different circumstances. But the ultimate banner that they were going to rally to is the name of the Lord, the character of God himself, the covenant-keeping I am God. it was to him. And so Moses didn't want people running to him or to saying, Moses is our banner, but the Lord is our banner. And you know, if you are walking with Jesus tonight, if you're taking this bread and wine because you believe Jesus died for you, the Lord is your banner. He's the place you rally. He's the one you rally to. It's under his name that we move forward together. Oakhall Church, okay, it's great. Caterham, it's cool. But the real banner we march under is under the name of Jesus. The Lord is our banner. We rally to him. And verse 16 explains that there was something else lifted up that day. Hands were lifted up against the throne of the Lord, meaning that the Amalekites were coming to undermine God's sovereignty. The Lord will be at war against the Amalekites from generation to generation. There is a God who is there, and he has created us and made us to live in line and in relationship with him. We've broken away from that relationship, and really, judgment should be the only destiny. But Jesus has come, and he's come and died in our place. And we're called now to align ourselves with God's purposes, to humble ourselves under the Lord as our banner. But if we resist, well, the point is coming, where the Lord will be at war with us, where the judgment will finally come on us. It's a sobering message, isn't it? There's a judgment coming. It's coming on us if we're not in line with God's will. The only way we can be aligned with God's will is by believing that Jesus has died for us, taken the punishment for us. And it leaves a big question, doesn't it? Where are we tonight? What are our priorities as we go into the week ahead? What's our vision for our family, for our mates, for our work? Is the Lord our banner? Let's have a couple more questions, and then I'll pray. So these couple of questions are coming up. So how does this impact your relationship with God this week? And does this change your approach to life this week? Let's take a couple of minutes to begin talking about it, and then we can talk some more over our teas and coffees.